Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game. And this is part one of my review of the new exclusive cards being added to Hearthstone's Arena as a part of the Taverns of Time event starting on June 11th. If you haven't heard, 28 new cards are being added to Arena, and Arena only 10 neutral cards, 2 class cards for each of the 9 classes in the game. Total of 28. And of course, I wanted to share my take on the power level for each of these cards. Now, of course, I haven't been playing a ton of Arena lately, so my opinion might not be as valid as some of the other people in the world out there who are Arena experts. Of course, I would encourage you to take a look at all the great minds out there talking Hearthstone. Nonetheless, I wanted to share my take. I'm a decent Arena player. I have a general idea of what makes cards good in Hearthstone, so I thought you might still find some value in my spin on these cards as well. That said, let's go ahead and jump into my review of the neutral cards. We'll catch up with the class cards in a future video. For now, we have 10 neutral cards from the Taverns of Time Arena event. Here we go. Up first here, I have Cromie. And Cromie's, of course, a character everybody knows now thanks to Monster Hunt, but has been a pretty popular Warcraft lore character for a while. I've made custom cards with Cromie in the past. And here we finally have our first official Hearthstone card of Cromie. And she is a meager 4 mana 4/4 at her base. But of course, she has a really cool battle cry. Shuffle 4 historical epochs into your deck. And if you don't know what those are, got them handy here. Essentially 4 mana spells, and you're going to shuffle all 4 of them into your deck, not just one randomly, all 4, which is insane because each of these is really good and going to be an incredibly high impact card in Arena. So first off, you have Opening the Dark Portal. Add 2 random legendary minions to your hand and draw a card. And you cast Opening the Dark Portal immediately when it's drawn, as you do for the rest of these as well. So you don't even have to spend the mana on these. This is something that just happens and it cycles into a new card as well. So it doesn't take your turn or steal your draw. You just get this free bonus essentially. And of course, generating 2 legendary minions out of thin air is a great thing to have happen basically for free. Are they always going to be amazing legendaries? No, but sometimes they're going to be fantastic. And of course, they're going to be unexpected in regards to your opponent. They'll have no idea what you could possibly have because they're going to be random. So a great tool and asset to have. Up next is Escape from Durnhold, which adds 2 random spells to your hand. Same exact story as the previous card. Spells might be even better than legendaries on average, although of course there are still some duds. But again, unpredictable free assets added to your hand, incredibly valuable in Arena. The Culling of Strathholm is your third option. That one deals 2 damage to all enemies. So essentially, Consecration cast for free. Now, admittedly, the unpredictability of this one means it might fall a little bit short or not be particularly useful sometimes, because your opponent doesn't necessarily always have a Consecration ready board. Sometimes it might just hit big stuff, sometimes it might hit nothing at all. But even at its worst, it's still a free 2 damage to the enemy hero. That's always going to happen. And there's no downside to it, so it's completely fine. And occasionally it's going to hit really big, setting up other AoEs, clearing a board, killing your opponent on occasion. So it's a good card to have, even if it's not always perfect, still a completely free bonus. And then finally, Battle for Mount Hyjal, same exact story. Give your minions +2/+2 is fantastic. Completely free. Sometimes it'll whiff, just like the previous option. You may not have minions on board, but those occasional times you do, a free buff like that, absolutely incredible. You're going to set up trades, going to give you more damage. And again, completely free from a tempo and card resource standpoint. So all upside on all 4 of these cards, no downsides. They're all incredible, and theoretically you could draw all 4 in a single turn. And the fact that there are 4 of them means you're fairly likely to get one at any given point. If you play Cromie on turn 4, for instance, in a normal Arena deck, you might have 20, 22 cards, something like that left. So 4 out of 20 is not that bad of an odd right off the top. And as you progress throughout a game, of course, you're more and more likely to see these things actually popping up. Now, Cromie herself is a 4-mana 4/4. Clearly, you're sacrificing a little bit there in stats. You're not getting the best minion possible for 4 mana, but despite that, she's still got a reasonable body, and considering all of the giant upside each of these epochs actually offer, that is well worth the minimal downside of Cromie. 4/4s for 4 aren't terrible in Arena, and the upside here is just enormous. So she's going to be a fantastic option for Arena. You're going to have to pick her if you see her. It's an easy choice. Really, really strong 5-star card as far as I'm concerned. So up next here we have the Wildlands Adventurer, a 5-mana 5/5 neutral card. Battlecry reads, add a random card from the Hall of Fame to your hand. Now, Hall of Fame here means exactly what it says in your Hearthstone collection. If you go to the Hall of Fame, you'll essentially see cards that have been moved from classic format to wild format, things like Azure Drake and Power Overwhelming, and I guess Ragnaros most notably. Most recently, we had Cold Light Oracle, Ice Block, and Molten Giant moved to the Hall of Fame. This is essentially how Blizzard deals with problem cards. And beyond that, there are some others. Let's see. Conceal. Actually, I have a list here. Captain's Parrot, Old Murkai, Gelbin Mechatork, Elite Tauren Chieftain, and, of course, Sylvanas Windrunner as well. So you can essentially draw any of those cards or generate any of those cards, add it to your hand. And for the most part, those are pretty solid cards. Now, a few of those might not be particularly strong in any given Arena deck. For instance, you may not always need an Ice Lance, but even that can be a really cool tempo stall that slows down your opponent, allows you to set up some trades, keeps you alive for a turn or two. Things like Power Overwhelming are fantastic. Azure Drake's great. Ragnaros is, of course, amazing. Sylvanas. Even like Elite Tauren Chieftain and Gelbin Mechatork may not be amazing cards, but they're just fine bodies and an extra card to throw down in Arena, which can be important. Old Murkai and Cold Light Oracle as Murlocs are fairly situational. I guess Old Murkai's fine just because he has 2 attack and he has charge. That's okay. That's going to help you clear up little bodies from time to time. Cold Light Oracle can be risky. So, and Captain's Parrot, of course, is really, really terrible most of the time, unless you happen to have a pirate. But I would say basically, you know, half of your options here are really, really strong. Another 25% are pretty okay, and the remainder might not be fantastic. So 75% of the time, you're going to get a great card off of your Wildlands Adventurer. 25% of the time, maybe not something amazing, but still just a free resource. And since this is all attached to a 5-mana 5/5, which is an okay play too, that's a reasonable stat line for 5 mana, it's okay to slam bodies in Arena like that, then this is another really strong card, because occasionally you're going to high roll into Sylvanas and Ragnaros, and those are going to be incredible tools to help you win games. Other times you might get a card that's not all that handy, but you didn't sacrifice much for that potential upside. So over the course of an entire Arena run, Wildlands Adventure is going to have a huge net positive impact on your deck's success, making this, again, I think, a 5-star Arena card. So up next here we have the Time Way Wanderer, a 5-mana 6/3, and the battlecry reads, discover a spell, reduce its cost by 5, and then put it on top of your deck. And yet again, this card is just bonkers good, I think. It's fantastic. First off, in Arena, we've seen in the past that playing cards with stat allocations like this that generate you other stuff is completely fine. There have been numerous examples of cards like this that work. The 3 health, of course, can be a downside, but sometimes in Arena, that's just still awkward to deal with, and the 6 attack presents a threat and trades up. And the battle cry here is just so strong, because first off, it's discover a spell, so that's going to be from your given class. And often spells are pretty darn nice to have, right? And you're going to reduce its cost by 5, which means you get a lot of control and finesse over what you pick and lining it up for your next turn, because it is being added to the top of your deck. So you know you're going to draw it next turn. So for instance, let's say something like Druid can easily always pick Ultimate Infestation. They can put a 5-mana Ultimate Infestation on top of their deck and just have a ridiculously powerful turn the very next turn for only 5 mana. That's insane. And there are many other classes that have powerful high-cost spells. Now, in some classes like Paladin, for instance, you might not want Time Way Wanderer as much, because you could easily low roll into like a couple Secrets and a Holy Light, none of which get a great cost reduction and which you don't really want to top deck, even if they're free, because you are sacrificing a card draw that could be something better or more meaty for a turn 6 sort of play. So I'm not saying this is going to be fantastic in every class, but clearly there are some instances where this thing is fantastic and just absolutely wonderful. Druid, I think, namely among them solely because of Ultimate Infestation, but essentially any class with spells in that 4+ mana range are probably going to have some way to utilize Timeway Wonder in a really big way. And again, even as a 6/3, not a great play for 5 mana from a body standpoint, but again, the upside, the opportunity that this card offers is so much worth any sort of risk for playing an understated minion. So again, an easy 5-star card for me. I absolutely love Timeway Wanderer. I don't know if I accidentally put these in order of like awesome cards first or what, but I think we have another strong card here with the Timeline Witness, a 3-mana 2/4 that reads, instead of drawing your normal card each turn, you instead discover a card from your deck. So essentially, while this thing is alive on board, you get to have your choice. You basically get to start each turn with tracking, without the downside of tracking, discarding your remaining cards, but you get to pick what you want. And of course, that's a great asset because it allows you to pick things that you might need in that specific turn. If you drop this thing on turn 3 and you don't have a turn 4 follow-up, Timeline Witness gives you the opportunity to suddenly say, okay, I can pick what I need. I can play on curve. I don't lose any tempo. I don't sacrifice anything. It's just a completely free bonus. You could stock up on a really big threat for later down the road. If you have some insane card you want to get into play as soon as possible, this increases your likelihood of finding that sort of thing. So it just adds a lot of influence and control to your decisions and your card draw, which normally in Arena, there are a lot of dud cards in your deck, and your card draw can really punish you. So if you're able to keep this thing alive on board significantly, for a significantly long period, it's going to pay off huge dividends. Now, the biggest risk with Timeline Witness is that as a 2/4 on turn 3, it could very easily die in a lot of different board states and scenarios, and as a top deck late in the game, it's particularly likely to be low impact. Because even if you do have the mana to slot it into a later game turn, there's a very, very good chance your opponent will be able to kill it, and you won't actually get the benefit when it passes back to your turn, because it'll already be dead. You'll never get the chance to discover a card. So probably a card that's much stronger in the early to mid game, right around turn 3. And that is often a really important time in Arena, because if you whiff on some of those important mid-game turns, it can be hard to recover, and your opponent might just get ahead and snowball to victory, as you often see in Arena. So clearly a strong card. Not as good as the ones we've seen so far. I would probably land at 4 stars for this card, just because, again, not much of a sacrifice for stats. A lot of potential upside. It's occasionally going to help you win a game, and it's not that big of a not that weak of a play in normal scenarios either, even if it's just a 2/4 that absorbs some hits. That's okay. It's a high friction card. It's something your opponent has to recognize as a threat, which could create some not misplays necessarily, but create some poor decision making or some rushed plays on their side, so that they remove this card to prevent it from creating additional value for you. So 4-star card. So up next here we have the Timebound Giant, a cool new giant. A 15 mana, 8/8, and it costs 1 less for each card you've drawn. So for a card like Timebound Giant, if you think about this in a normal scenario, let's say turn 7, you've drawn 7 cards. Timebound Giant would be an 8 mana, 8/8, because you've reduced its cost by 7. If you get to turn 10, that means it's a 5 mana, 8/8, which that's probably where it turns the corner on being a really solid play in Arena. 6 mana 8/8 is certainly okay. 7 mana 8/8 is like, nah. Anything more than that, it's just way too slow, not worth it. It's just a big stat pile for not a reasonable amount of mana. But as you get to 5 mana, 4 mana, clearly down to 0 mana, becomes a pretty interesting card. Now, what that means is, in some games, it's going to be an incredible late game top deck. If you're 10, 12, 15 turns into the game, Timebound Giant's going to be a super low tempo 0 mana 8/8. And that would be amazing. Those are scenarios where it's good. But unfortunately, A lot of arena games are well over by the time you get to turn 10, turn 12, turn 15. Somebody has snowballed. The game is literally ended because somebody has killed you before then or you've killed your opponent. And a card like Timebound Giant just wouldn't ever make an impact. Beyond that, there are other arena game scenarios where you and your opponent are both essentially in top deck mode at the end of a game, and you're drawing one card per turn, and you're pretty much always playing that card out, hero powering, and that's it. And in those scenarios, if you draw a 0 mana Timebound Giant because you're 15, 20 turns into the game, it doesn't matter that it's 0 mana. It could have been 8 mana because you have 8 spare mana to float anyway. So a lot of the upside of this card in those late game scenarios probably gets reduced anyway, just because you don't need as much of a mana reduction. So essentially I'm saying I don't know that there's much of a sweet spot for this card to be really powerful. I think it's an okay thing to draft. Of course, as with all of these cards, I should have talked about it previously, they have to be better than the other cards in their bucket when you're choosing them in Arena. I think in all the past examples, the cards have a very high likelihood to be that. I don't think Timebound Giant's a card that's necessarily going to convince you to pick it over other options, depending, of course, upon which bucket Blizzard decides to slot this thing into. So where's the sweet spot for Timebound Giant? I don't know. If you happen to have a deck that somehow has a ton of card draw built in, or alternatively, if you're playing Warlock and you anticipate more of a grinder style deck where you're using your hero power and planning to make a comeback style game, Timebound Giant obviously gets some gains in both of those styles because you accelerate the cost discount for each additional card that you draw. And that might help you find that sweet spot a little bit sooner. So clearly certain deck types in a class in particular with Warlock might have a better use for Timebound Giant than average. So most of the time I think this is really only about a 2-star card, but in those specific instances could clearly be a 3-star or higher card if the deck is a perfect fit. Moving on to our next option here, we have the Temporal Anomaly, a 2-mana 2/2 elemental that reads, when you draw this, add a random spell to your hand. And this is a cool little card and something I actually wish we'd see more of in Hearthstone in constructed format. And clearly as a 2-mana 2/2, not a particularly exciting sort of thing. Not a great stat line for 2 mana. Trades into 3/2s, but of course dies for free to 2/3s. So nothing about this as a 2-mana 2/2 is exciting. It all has to boil down to whether or not this effect is worth it. And interestingly, one thing I like about this card is that it's one of those rare cards that's a low-cost card that's okay in the early game, but also pretty reasonably good in the late game as well. In other words, when you top deck this thing turn 10, turn 15, it's still adding some value to your hand immediately, as opposed to just a dead 2-drop, which you often find yourself drawing in Arena because you had to fill out your curve. You need 2-drops, you need 3-drops that just are basically boring piles of stats on turn 10 that just help you fill in your curve but don't do anything else. Instead of that, Temporal Anomaly does actually offer you a spell return. You get a free spell added to your hand, and sometimes that spell could be really impactful or really important because spells, of course, are immediate in their action and often above average in their effect for Arena, so really strong assets to have. So although you sacrifice a little bit in the early game, you get this payoff in the late game that adds up. And this is still the sort of thing, you could slam on turn 4 and combo with your hero power to make sure you get some stats onto the board and you're not completely wasting all of that mana, allowing you to at least keep up a little bit in regards to tempo, and it's still good on turn 20 as well. Now, I will note that I think based on the wording of this card, if you keep this in your mulligan, it will not generate the spell for you because you don't draw from your mulligan. Draw is the action that happens from being pulled out of your deck and into your hand. So that's an interesting downside for this card. Essentially, it's a 2-drop that you don't want to find in your mulligan. And occasionally it's going to pop into your mulligan anyway, and it's going to be a really bad minion. And of course, if you're filling out a curve in Arena, you want your 2-drops to be playable on turn 2. So you kind of have to consider this card as a non-2-drop value generator. It's a little bit awkward in that way, but nonetheless still offers some nice return. So I think this is probably a 3-star card. I have a feeling even though it's solid and it pays off and has some upside, it's going to be one of those things that's hard to compete with in its bucket. I think you'll find you want other cards that are more consistent or more reliable or more singular in the direction of what they do. So Temporal Anomaly is certainly okay, is completely playable and fine, and will add some value to certain kinds of decks. probably not a guaranteed hit in any given arena deck. So up next here we have the Stasis Dragon, a 6-mana 10/10 that starts dormant, which is the same thing as the Darkness. It just is a empty circle on the board. It doesn't do anything, can't be attacked, can't attack at all, isn't affected by AoE or anything like that. And then after 2 turns, it awakens with Rush. So if you hold out for 2 turns, your Stasis Dragon wakes up and it can attack into a minion immediately. And frankly, I just don't think this card's going to be very good at all. There are a lot of problems here. Basically on turn 6, you're sacrificing, or at least any given turn, you're sacrificing 6 mana for a very, very delayed payoff. And since tempo is king in Arena, you just can't sacrifice mana for that long and expect to be in a good spot in 2 turns where it actually pays off in a big way. And then even the payoff itself for Stasis Dragon doesn't feel all that awesome to me, because yes, a 10/10 can kill a thing, but it can't kill multiple things the single turn in which it's finally able to attack. So for instance, if your opponent plays a bunch of 3/3s, your Stasis Dragon can kill 1 3/3 immediately the turn it's finally resummoned. That's not awesome. Like, yes, on the off chance your opponent plays a 9/9, you feel pretty good about Stasis Dragon. But across so many other board states, this thing's just going to feel terrible when it wakes up. It's going to take a really long time for it to get any sort of value, because it'll kill a tiny minion. A super baby taunt can interrupt it, for instance. And then it doesn't get to attack face for another turn after that, essentially. So it's not even like this face damage threat. If it awoke with charge, I think it would have some interesting applications as a finisher tool, like a delayed finisher, and this threat that your opponent had to consistently be worried about. But as it stands with only Rush and the inability for it to, trade into smaller, wider boards, it's going to be really hard for decks to find time to play this. Just sacrificing your entire turn 6 or a majority even of a turn 10 is going to feel really, really bad a vast majority of the time. I think if this was like 3 4/4s, if you'd said like summon 3 4/4s, they all start dormant and then awaken with Rush after 2 turns, that would be an awesome card. Like, that would be competitive, because you'd have so many different ways to utilize those 4/4s. They'd be able to make a more direct impact across wide boards. But with Stasis Dragon, I just don't think this thing's going to be good at all. I don't think it makes any sense. So unfortunately, this to me looks like a 1-star card. Up next here, we have the Possibilityseeker, a 4-mana 4/5 with a crazy battle cry. It says shuffle your hand into your deck and draw that many cards. So essentially what happens is, say you have 5 cards in your hand, you take those 5 cards, you move them into your deck, and then you draw 5 cards from your newly shuffled deck. And of course, I guess theoretically you could get the exact same 5 cards back. That would be super unlikely. You might get 1 or 2 back on occasion, but mostly you'll get 5 fresh new cards from your Possibilityseeker. But it's interesting whether or not that would actually be useful. I mean, clearly, if you have like a terrible mulligan and the cards you have in hand are just awful, and you have like 5 legendaries in your deck and you got a bunch of garbage commons instead in your opening hand, sure, you could try to upgrade your hand essentially by shuffling into better stuff. But if you think about it from a mulligan and card usage standpoint, say, for instance, you got an 8-drop, a 7-drop, a 6-drop, and an 8-drop in your opening mulligan. And you're like, oh my god, I have passed my first 3 turns. And you get to turn 4, and you want to play Possibilityseeker to get some good cards. The problem is now you need those big-bodied, thick 8-mana, 7-mana, 6-mana cards, because that's the next phase of the game you're moving into. So it would be kind of weird to try to replace a bad mulligan, because by the time you turn the corner with Possibilityseeker, anything that was a bad mulligan becomes an interestingly powerful mid-game, and you might accidentally turn your 6-drops into 1-drops and have a terrible mid-game instead. So the alternative is that you had a bunch of 1-drops and 2-drops and 3-drops in your opening hand, but of course you've played those out in the first opening part of the game, and you might not necessarily need Possibilityseeker. So it ends up in this weird place where it's like maybe maybe 2 or 3 cards in your hand you want to replace, maybe a couple you want to keep, and it's just like, what do I do? What is the likelihood that my hand ends up better in any given scenario? And frankly, the likelihood's probably just always about the same. On average, you're going to end up with about the same kind of quality hands you had now, and only very rarely are you going to be looking to replace something exactly. So in some ways, it's almost like this is a null effect where you're just replacing random cards with random cards, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything. In other scenarios, you might be looking for specific sorts of things or trying to draw into some perfect answer, and Possibilityseeker opens up some options. But then finally, a third and the worst case scenario is that you have a hand you like and you don't want to play Possibilityseeker. In other words, you're scared you're going to lose the stuff you need, and you have a couple awesome legendaries or good spells in hand, and then you have this dead 4-mana card that you really wanted to play because you need a Chillwind Yeti on turn 4. So essentially, it's usually a wash. Usually you didn't really accomplish anything. Very rarely it's good, and very rarely it's terrible. And you got to decide, is that going to be worth it? Why would I want to use this card most of the time? It's hard to say you'd ever really want to do it. So in some cases, it looks like a Chillwind Yeti with a lot of risk attached to it. And that makes me pretty nervous. I don't know why you'd want that necessarily. So even though there are those, unicorn scenarios where, yes, Possibilityseeker is awesome, I just think the chance to backfire and the chance to be a stranded card in your hand is far too high. So a neat effect, a cool effect, but ultimately to me, probably still just a 2-star card. Up next here we have Murres Aand, and I honestly am having trouble figuring out if this thing's amazing or terrible. It's a 7-mana 6/6, so okay stats for the cost, not anything amazing. The battle cry reads, from now on, your turns are 15 seconds, and you draw 2 extra cards. So keep in mind that says from now on. This is not an effect that only persists while Murres Aand is on the board. So not something like Nozdormu, for instance. It lasts for the rest of the game. And that means you kind of have this baked-in Alaneth that is always drawing you 2 cards at the start of every turn. Now, it's not as bad as Alaneth or as aggressive as Alaneth because it's only 2 extra cards instead of 3, but it still adds this kind of weird inevitability to a game, much like Alaneth often does in very aggressive Tempo Mage decks, where you're eventually going to run out of cards and you're eventually probably going to have a full hand. Particularly because in Arena, it's much, much harder to build a deck full of hyper-aggressive, low-cost, high-tempo sorts of things. So, of course, Tempo Mages, a lot of low-cost spells, a lot of burn damage that they want to draw into so they can end the game. In Arena, that's just not possible. He's going to draw you 6 drops and 7 drops and 4 drops, and it's going to be hard to play out enough stuff so that you don't start to overdraw with Murres Aand and eventually burn cards and fatigue. But I think more importantly, it's going to be really difficult to draw into game-ending sorts of hands. Tempo Mage, you always hit those fireballs and pyroblasts, and you know you're going to end the game before you fatigue and die. Murres Aand, you don't know that. You could just fatigue and die and try to play enough stuff, but your opponent just has answers because you're not able to unload cards quickly enough. So you'd almost have to build a really specific deck to support Murres Aand that's like really aggressive and includes a ton of low-cost cards and burn damage. But of course, you don't know that you're going to get Murres Aand in arena drafts. You'd have to get him first. You'd have to get the supporting pieces. It's just really hard to make all that work. Now, I do think, outside of that sort of terminal game state that this could achieve, there are like 2 or 3 turns immediately after playing Murres Aand where it's a very, very powerful effect. Particularly if your hand is looking a little light. If you only got a couple cards in hand, you play a 6/6 reasonably statted thing, contest the board. You start to generate a lot of resources. Maybe you can overwhelm your opponent with resources if you're both in that mid to end game state where you're running out of stuff. You might just be able to overpower and win on the board. So that's why I'm a little bit torn with this card, because I do think if it lines up right, this could give you a nice distinct edge and help you turn the corner in a value-style arena game where you just overwhelm your opponent. If that doesn't work, if they have AoE, if they have stall, they have taunts, then you're going to kill yourself. So where does Murres Aand fall on that? Is he better and faster than I think? Or is he going to backfire like Alaneth often can without any of that potential upside? Now, the other elephant in the room I haven't even talked about is that you only get 15 seconds per turn. So you have this constant Nozdormu effect, which theoretically is a non-factor if you're a really talented Hearthstone player and you can see all the lines. But for most of us, that is incredibly stressful and is going to make you fail sometimes, make really bad plays. You're going to misplay. You're not going to see all the things that you need, particularly when your hand is full of stuff. It's going to be like, oh my God, I have so many decisions. What do I do? What do I do? I only have 15 seconds. So ultimately, I think between the time restriction and the fact that this has that potential to burn out and backfire, I don't think Murres Aand is a great arena card. I think this is probably a 2-star card. But by God, those couple times when it works and you're able to just overwhelm on the first few Murres Aand turns, it can be really, really good. So it's got that potential to be insane, but most of the time, for the average Hearthstone player, this thing is far more risky than it is powerful. 2 stars. And here we have the perfect card to support Murres Aand, the Infinite Murloc. I kind of joke, but I'm kind of serious too. So the Infinite Murloc here is a 1-mana 1/1. It's a Murloc, of course, and it reads Battle Cry, shuffle an Infinite Murloc into your deck. Your future Infinite Murlocs get +1/+1. So this is sort of kind of Jade Idol, right? You shuffle a Jade into your deck, each subsequent Jade gets a little bit bigger. And that's pretty cool, but I don't think it's necessarily very good. And the reason for that is because before the Infinite Murlocs get really, really powerful, say, 4/4s, 5/5s, because they do stay 1 mana, keep in mind. So you get a 1 mana 2/2, a 1 mana 3/3, a 1 mana 4/4. But I don't think that's impactful enough in Arena until basically that 4/4 mark, that 5/5 mark. Because essentially, if you're on turn 3 or turn 4, even playing a 1 mana 2/2, 1 mana 3/3 just isn't that big of an impact. And of course, each time you draw this, you are sacrificing another draw in your deck. That's the only thing you get is a 1 mana 3/3 or a 1 mana 4/4. So I think you have a pretty good chance of running out of stuff pretty quickly with Infinite Murlocs, because even though they're high tempo plays, there's just not that much raw value in any given Infinite Murloc. So the sacrifice of a few good draws to make the Infinite Murloc relevant and competitive might not be worth the upside of getting those cheap stats into play. Because there is that, again, kind of sweet spot or magic number where this thing turns the corner and becomes really powerful. Because yes, at some point, drawing a 1 mana 12/12 is going to be good no matter what state you're in, just because it's a 12/12, right? But it takes a long time to get there, and the first few turns and the first few Infinite Murlocs probably aren't all that good, and they're a bit of a sacrifice. So, I mean, I'm not saying this thing's terrible by any means. Like, if you build your deck correctly, if you have plenty of card draw, think like Warlock, for instance, clearly even a 1 mana 3/3 is still pretty solid. 1 mana 2/2 is an Enchanted Raven. At the end of the day, that's not that bad. So I'm not trashing the card. I'm just reining in your expectations a little bit, I hope, and keeping your reality in check. So essentially I'm saying I think it's about a 3-star card. It's reasonable to play. It's okay. It's just not going to be that 1 mana 8/8 that's super duper exciting and wins you the game. It's just going to be another piece of the puzzle that will sometimes work and probably only work in decks that have a lot of card draw to mitigate the risk of the first few Infinite Murlocs really disrupting your value chain and keeping your curve all wacky. So good, reasonable, playable, but not amazing necessarily 3 stars. And there you go, folks. That's it for the neutral Taverns of Time Arena exclusive cards. Some pretty crazy stuff, really fun and interesting mechanics introduced here. It's gonna be it's gonna be fun to play Arena when this stuff hits. I actually can't wait. I've had a bit of a break from Arena, so it's gonna be nice to jump back in and see how much chaos and havoc these cards can actually have on the Arena meta. That said, I'm not done. There's going to be a part 2 for my Arena card reviews. We only talked about neutral cards here. We also have talked about class cards, so stay tuned here on my YouTube channel for the next part of this video where I talk about the class cards, which also includes some absolutely nutty, bonkers, ridiculous stuff. So it's going to be really fun to talk through all those. That said, if you guys have thoughts, comments, recommendations, insights, disagreements, of course, share those in the comments below. Like I said, I'm not the foremost Arena expert these days, so take my opinion with a healthy dose of doubt and consideration. Of course, seek out other second opinions, including those in the comments below, because people will have a lot of cool stuff to say. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.